Hello, everyone. My name is Mary, and I'm a nurse at a small hospital in the countryside of Minas Gerais, in the town of São João del Rei. Today, I'm going to share a story that forever changed my life, something that happened during a night shift a few years ago. If you think hospitals are calm places at night, you are sorely mistaken. It was a Friday night, and I was scheduled for a 12-hour shift. I arrived at the hospital around 8 o'clock at night, and things were pretty quiet. Few patients, empty corridors, and an eerie feeling in the air. At the time, I had been working there for about 3 years and had faced some tough situations, but nothing had prepared me for what was to come. I started the night by reviewing medical records and checking on the patients. Most were sleeping, which was a relief. Night shifts can be exhausting, and a quiet night was always welcome. Around midnight, I began to feel a strange sensation. I can't explain it, but the atmosphere seemed different. The fluorescent lights in the corridors seemed dimmer, and the silence was oppressive, as if something was about to happen. While making my rounds, I stopped at room 208. Mrs. Cecilia, a kind elderly lady, was hospitalized with pneumonia. She had always been very friendly, and I enjoyed chatting with her during the shifts. That night, however, she was different. When I entered the room, I found her sitting up in bed, staring intently at the door. Her eyes were wide open, and she was murmuring something I couldn't understand. "Mariana, someone is trying to enter the room," she said, her voice trembling. I tried to calm her, assuring her that everything was fine and that I would stay there until she fell asleep. But as I spoke, a chill ran down my spine. The feeling that something was wrong only grew. I decided to pull up a chair and sit beside her for a few minutes. As we talked, I heard a strange noise from the corridor, like a whisper. I tried to ignore it, but Mrs. Cecilia squeezed my hand tightly, her eyes fixed on the door. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice filled with fear. Yes, I had heard it. I slowly stood up and opened the door to check. The corridor was empty, but the feeling of being watched was almost unbearable. I returned to the room and found Mrs. Cecilia even more agitated. She insisted that someone was there, trying to get in. I decided to lock the door, something we normally don't do, but I wanted her to feel safe. As I tried to calm her, the whisper returned, louder this time. It seemed to come from all directions, as if the walls were murmuring. Fear began to take over me. The feeling that something was deeply wrong intensified with each passing minute. Mrs. Cecilia finally fell asleep, but I was restless. I left the room and began walking the corridors, trying to locate the source of the noise. The hospital, which had always been a place of safety and healing, now felt like a dark and threatening labyrinth. I passed by the staff break room and noticed it was dark, although the light usually stayed on at night. I decided to enter the room to check the light switch, and the scene I encountered there was disturbing. The room was chillingly cold, much colder than the rest of the hospital. In the center of the room, there was a small mirror, one of those used for quick appearance checks. The mirror was broken, and the scattered pieces on the floor reflected a shadowy figure that wasn't in the room. It was as if the mirror was showing something from another world, something that didn't belong in our reality. I ran back to room 208, my heart pounding in my chest. I found Mrs. Cecilia still sleeping, but the sensation of being watched persisted. I sat there beside her, trying to ignore the growing fear. The shift I thought would be peaceful was turning into a real nightmare. And I still didn't know that the worst was yet to come. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt you were being watched, even though you were alone? Stay with me until the end to find out what happened that night. I promise, it's something you'll never forget. As I sat next to Mrs. Cecilia, the tension in the air felt palpable. The hospital was eerily quiet, except for the occasional sound of whispers that seemed to come from all around. I tried to focus on my work, but the feeling of being watched never left me. It seemed like every shadow in the corners of the room hid something sinister, something I couldn't see, but could feel. Around 2 a.m., the corridor lights began to flicker, casting dancing shadows on the walls. My heart raced, and the chill down my spine intensified. I got up to check, but hesitated remembering what I had seen in the break room. I went to the room door, opened it slowly, and peeked into the corridor. It was empty, but the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. I returned to Mrs. Cecilia, who was now awake and visibly frightened. She grabbed my hand and said, "Mariana, they are here." I asked who they were, but she just shook her head, unable to explain. Suddenly, a loud noise echoed through the corridor, as if something heavy had fallen. I went to investigate, but found nothing out of place. When I returned to the room, Mrs. Cecilia was no longer there. The bed was empty, the sheets piled on the floor. Panic overtook me. How could she have left without me seeing? I ran through the corridors, checking each room, each corner, but there was no sign of her. I called the security and other colleagues, and we began a desperate search throughout the hospital. The sense of despair grew with each minute that passed without finding Mrs. Cecilia. As we ran through the corridors, I heard the sound of whispers again, now louder and more disturbing. It seemed like the walls were speaking, an incomprehensible sound that left me increasingly frightened. I remember looking at the faces of my colleagues and seeing the same fear reflected in them. It was then that my colleague Anna, who had always been skeptical about these things, came to me pale and trembling. She said she saw something strange in the employee break room. I was reluctant to go back there, but something in her expression made me realize this was no joke. We walked together to the room, and what we found there left me speechless. The break room was freezing, as if the temperature had dropped drastically in just a few minutes. In the center of the room, the broken mirror I had seen earlier seemed to have moved. The pieces were arranged in a strange pattern, almost like a symbol. The reflection in the mirror pieces showed something impossible, a tall, indistinct, shadowy figure that seemed to be staring directly at us. I looked behind, but the room was empty. As each minute passed, the panic increased. Patients began to report strange and unsettling dreams, all involving a faceless figure. Some reported feeling cold hands touching them while they slept. I knew I needed to remain calm, but my instinct told me that something very wrong was happening. Back in room 208, I noticed something that disturbed me even more. The wall clock had stopped. It was 2:15 a.m., the exact time when Mrs. Cecilia disappeared. All the clocks in the hospital, including our wristwatches, were stopped at the same time. We tried adjusting them several times, but the hands always returned to 2:15. It was as if time had frozen at that specific moment. As we discussed what to do, I heard the whisper again, this time clearer. It sounded like a voice calling for me. "Mariana." I looked around, but there was no one. The fear began to transform into pure terror. It seemed we were trapped in an endless nightmare. It was then we remembered something almost everyone had forgotten. Years ago, a nurse named Clara mysteriously disappeared from the same room 208 during a night shift. The circumstances were never explained, and the case was filed as unsolved. The story was told as a legend among the staff, but I never took it seriously. Until now. With panic taking over everyone, we decided to close the hospital to new admissions and keep the patients safe. As I walked through the empty corridors, I felt a constant presence, something that seemed to follow me, watch every move. What began as a peaceful night turned into one of the most terrifying moments of my life. If you think this is scary, wait until you hear the conclusion. I'll tell you how it all ended, but I warn you, it won't be easy to sleep after learning what happened. With the hospital on alert and the patients secured, the atmosphere was tense, as if something terrible could happen at any moment. As I walked through the corridors, every shadow seemed to have a life of its own, and the constant whispering did not leave me. I was exhausted, but I couldn't stop looking for Mrs. Cecilia and trying to understand what was happening. We decided to meet in the conference room to discuss our next steps. Anna was sitting next to me, still pale and trembling. The head of security, Paul, suggested we review the security camera footage, something we hadn't done yet. We agreed, and he went to the monitoring room while we waited anxiously. As we waited, the feeling of being watched intensified. I couldn't shake off the reflection in the mirror and the whispering voice that seemed to know my name. The room was in absolute silence, except for the sound of our own heartbeats, which seemed to echo through the walls. When Paul returned, he was visibly shaken. "You need to see this," he said, his voice full of disbelief. We followed him to the monitoring room, where he had prepared the recordings. The footage showed the hospital corridors, initially empty and calm. But at 2:15 a.m., exactly when the clock stopped, the cameras began to capture interference. The images shook and distorted, and we could see shadows moving quickly through the corridors. The most terrifying thing, however, was what we saw in room 208. The camera showed Mrs. Cecilia sleeping, and me beside her, holding her hand. Suddenly, the image violently shook, and a shadowy figure appeared next to the bed. It wasn't a person, but a tall, indistinct shadow. In a matter of seconds, the figure leaned over Mrs. Cecilia, and then the image went completely static. The video returned to normal a few minutes later, but Mrs. Cecilia had disappeared. I was still there, looking around desperately, unaware of what had just happened. Watching these images was terrifying, and the reality of what we were facing began to seep into our thoughts. Something supernatural was happening, something we couldn't control or understand. We decided that we needed to act quickly. Paul suggested we conduct a thorough search of the hospital, checking every corner, every room. As we prepared, the whisper returned, now clearer and more insistent.
Mariana, come?
It seemed to come from all sides, calling me to some unknown place. I tried to ignore it, but the voice seemed to be inside my head, echoing non-stop. As we walked through the corridors, the temperature seemed to drop even further. We reached an abandoned wing of the hospital, which hadn't been used for years. The walls were peeling, and the smell of mold was strong. Paul led the way, the flashlight trembling in his hand. Suddenly, he stopped, pointing the light at a locked door. "It's here," he said, his voice laden with certainty. Something was drawing us to that place, something we couldn't ignore. We broke down the door and entered. The room was empty, except for a chair in the center. Sitting in the chair, with her head down, was Mrs. Cecilia. My heart nearly stopped. I ran to her, but when I touched her, I realized she was cold as ice. She slowly lifted her head, and her eyes were different, empty, as if there was no life in them anymore. "Mariana, they are here," she said again, but the voice wasn't hers. It was the same voice I had heard in the whispers. Before we could react, the door slammed shut, locking us inside. Paul's flashlight failed, plunging us into darkness. The whisper turned into a deafening scream, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from all sides. We felt invisible hands touching us, pulling, trying to drag us to some unknown place. We fought against the panic, trying to find a way out. Paul managed to turn the flashlight back on, and we saw that the walls were covered in strange symbols, like those formed by the pieces of the mirror. The shadows danced around us, getting closer, more tangible. With a final effort, we managed to open the door and escape the room, closing it behind us. The scream abruptly ceased, leaving us breathless and in silence. When I looked back, the door appeared normal, as if nothing had happened. Mrs. Cecilia was no longer there, and the symbols on the walls had disappeared. We managed to leave the abandoned wing and return to the main hospital, but the sensation of terror followed us. The clock still marked 2:15, and the patients were restless, many murmuring about disturbing dreams. We decided that we could not stay there any longer, not with the imminent danger we faced. The next morning, the hospital was closed for investigations, but we never found answers. Mrs. Cecilia was never found, and the camera recordings mysteriously disappeared. We were all advised not to talk about what happened, but the trauma stayed with us. Today, whenever I pass by room 208, I feel a chill down my spine. I never found explanations for that night, and the mystery remains. Sometimes, during the night shifts, I still hear that whisper and see the shadows moving. And I wonder, am I destined to be the next? Have you ever felt like you were being watched, even when you were alone? Be careful, You never know what might be lurking in the shadows. And remember, some mysteries should never be unraveled. It was a Wednesday night, and the cold wind blowing through the deserted streets, a small town, seemed to herald that something was amiss. The clock struck 9 p.m. as I parked my car in front of the municipal hospital, an old and imposing building that had witnessed countless stories of life and death. The hospital had a heavy, almost suffocating air, and each step I took towards the entrance echoed a hollow sound that resonated within me. As soon as I entered, my unease grew. The long, poorly lit corridors seemed even more sinister at night. The walls, painted a faded green, gave the place an aged and decadent look. There was a tense calm in the air, like the calm before a storm. The few staff members on duty seemed absorbed in their tasks, but I could sense furtive glances and expressions of fatigue that revealed the harsh reality of working there. I went straight to the nurses' room, where I found some colleagues gathered. After exchanging a few courteous words and catching up on the cases of the shift, I took my clipboard and began my rounds. Around 10 p.m., I received a call from the geriatric ward. One of the patients, Mrs. Eleanor, was agitated. Mrs. Eleanor was a fragile and sweet elderly woman, but in recent months she had been alarming the staff with her stories about ghosts and spirits that, according to her, roamed the hospital. I never paid much attention to it, thinking it was just the effects of dementia and the loneliness many of our patients faced. But that night, something in her voice over the phone made me uneasy. When I arrived at Mrs. Eleanor's room, I found her sitting on the bed, her eyes fixed on the wall. The room was dark, lit only by a weak yellow light that cast ghostly shadows on the walls. The sound of the wall clock ticking the seconds seemed amplified in the sepulchral silence of the night. "Mrs. Eleanor, what's happening?" I asked softly, trying not to scare her more than she already seemed to be. She slowly turned her head towards me, her eyes wide with fear. "She's back," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The woman from the corridor is here again." A shiver ran down my spine. Her words echoed in my mind, creating a sense of dread I couldn't explain. I tried to comfort her, saying that everything was fine and that there was no one there. But she gripped my hand with surprising strength for someone so fragile, her eyes locked on mine. "You don't understand," she said, almost crying. "She comes every night. Stands in the corridor, watching. She wants something, but I don't know what." I looked down the corridor through the slightly open door, but saw nothing beyond the darkness. However, the feeling of being watched was undeniable. It was as if the darkness itself had eyes, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I stayed in Mrs. Eleanor's room for a while longer, talking to her about trivial things until she finally fell asleep. Her breathing calmed, but the expression of fear on her face did not completely disappear. I left the room with a lump in my throat, trying to understand what had just happened. As I walked through the corridors back to the nurse's room, my unease only grew. Every sound, every shadow, seemed charged with hidden meaning, as if the hospital itself was trying to tell me something. I didn't know what to expect in the coming hours, but one thing was certain: it would be a night I would never forget. With my mind still haunted by Mrs. Eleanor's words, I tried to focus on my tasks as the minutes dragged on. With each step through the corridors, I felt an increasing tension. The hospital seemed quieter than usual, and the sound of my own footsteps echoed unnervingly. The light from the fluorescent lamps hanging from the ceiling cast erratic shadows on the walls, intensifying the feeling that something was out of place. Around midnight, I received a call to check on some patients in the geriatric ward. The lights in the corridor were dim, and I felt as if I were walking through a labyrinth of shadows. The sensation of being watched did not leave me in peace. I looked around, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread enveloping me. As I reached the end of one of the less frequented corridors, I felt a change in the environment. The air seemed colder, and a chilly draft swept through my body. A faint light from a dirty window dimly lit the corridor, creating a surreal and almost dreamlike setting. That's when I spotted a figure at the end of the corridor. At first, it seemed to be a disoriented patient. The woman was dressed in a hospital gown, with white, disheveled hair. Her walk was odd, gliding across the floor without lifting her feet, as if she were floating. Her steps seemed gentle, yet carried an invisible weight. "Ma'am, are you all right?" I asked, my voice trying to be firm but sounding tremulous. The woman did not respond, just continued moving away from me. There was something deeply wrong with that scene. The environment seemed to be getting colder, and I could see my breath condensing in the air. I decided to follow the figure, my curiosity mixed with a growing sense of fear. With each step I took, it felt as if the darkness around me was closing in. The sound of my footsteps echoed frantically, and I wondered if the woman was really going somewhere or just wandering aimlessly. When I finally managed to get closer, the woman turned slowly. Her face was pale and her gaze was empty, as if she were looking through me. Her eyes were deep and lifeless, reflecting infinite sadness. It was a look I had never seen before and left me feeling as if I were staring directly into the abyss. "Please, what's happening?" I tried again, my voice coming out almost as a whisper. The woman did not speak a word. Instead, she began to move away again, moving even faster and more silently. I began to run after her, but as I got closer, she seemed to distance herself more, as if she were dissolving into the darkness. At the moment I tried to reach her, the figure disappeared into a cold mist that spread through the corridor. The air was frozen, and I felt as though I was in a setting from a nightmare. It seemed as though the very atmosphere was charged with an indescribable presence. I returned to the nurse's room, my heart racing and my mind full of unanswered questions. When I told a colleague what I had seen, she tried to reassure me, saying I was tired and seeing things. But when I looked at her, I saw a flicker of concern in her eyes, as if she knew there was something more there, something everyone preferred to ignore. I sat for a moment, trying to process what had happened. The feeling that something was profoundly wrong would not leave me in peace. Every sound from outside, every shadow that moved, seemed to be connected to the presence I had seen. Now, reflecting on the situation, the feeling of despair and confusion mixed with palpable fear. The night was far from over, and I felt I was about to face something even more disturbing. If what I had seen was just the beginning, then I needed to be prepared for what was still to come. As the night progressed, the feeling of anxiety seemed to grow with each minute. The clock in the nurse's station ticked each second with a thudding sound that intensified my nervousness. Every time the noise of a door opening or the sound of an unexpected phone call filled the silence, my heart skipped a beat. I needed to return to Mrs. Eleanor's room. The restlessness wouldn't leave me in peace, and the need to check on her well-being was urgent. Upon entering the room, the sight of the elderly woman lying in bed, her eyes closed in a semblance of calm, was in stark contrast to the charged atmosphere I felt around me. Mrs. Eleanor awoke with the noise of the door and looked at me with an expression that mixed relief and a deep sadness. "You came back," she murmured, her voice tired. "I knew you would. How are you feeling?" I asked, trying to sound encouraging, but the feeling that something was wrong kept me uneasy. She motioned for me to come closer. Her gaze was intense, as if trying to convey a vital message. "I don't know if you're ready to hear this," she said gravely. "But what you saw was no coincidence. The woman in the corridor is real. She is the soul of Anna, a patient who was neglected and left this world alone." Mrs. Eleanor then began to tell her story, which felt more like a confession than a common tale. Anna, according to her, had been a forgotten patient, left in an isolated room without proper care. Her death was solemn and forsaken, and her soul was condemned to wander the corridors in search of justice. The story was terrifying, but the worst was yet to come. Mrs. Eleanor revealed that in recent weeks, the woman had begun to manifest more intensely. Sightings and signs of her presence were becoming more frequent and disturbing. According to her, the woman in the corridor was looking for someone to hear her story and possibly to avenge the injustice she suffered. As she spoke, the environment around us seemed to become even more charged with tension. The air was dense and cold, and the sounds of the night seemed amplified, as if the hospital was absorbing every word Mrs. Eleanor said. Suddenly, the light in the room began to flicker. The sound of thunder from outside made the window panes tremble, and the weak light cast distorted shadows on the walls. The room seemed to be transforming into a nightmare scene, and I felt the atmosphere becoming increasingly oppressive. Mrs. Eleanor looked at me with genuine fear. "You should not stay here alone," she whispered. "Her presence is stronger now, and she will not be content with just one victim." I tried to calm her, but the fear I felt was as tangible as the cold setting into the environment. When I left the room, the feeling of being watched intensified. The shadows around seemed to move with a life of their own, and the corridor seemed to stretch interminably. On my way back to the nurses' station, the hospital seemed immersed in sepulchral silence. Every sound seemed to come from a distant place, and I felt a growing weight in my chest. The sensation that something was about to happen was almost unbearable. I reached the nurses' station and tried to focus on my duties, but it was impossible to ignore the sense of dread. As the shift was about to end, the tension was at its peak. The hospital seemed to be waiting for something, and I was eager for my journey in that place to end. At the end of the night, as I left the hospital, I looked back one last time. The old building seemed to wrap itself in a cloak of darkness, and a feeling of unease accompanied me. There was something inexplicable about that place, something that could not simply be ignored. The sensation of having experienced something supernatural, something that defies any logical explanation, stayed with me. I knew that Mrs. Eleanor's story and the presence of the woman in the corridor were more than just tales of an old hospital. They were a reminder that sometimes, the unexplainable can become real in ways we cannot comprehend. Now, every time the wind howls through the city or the light flickers at night, I wonder if the woman in the corridor is lurking, waiting for justice or a new victim. What do you think happened that night? Is the woman in the corridor still haunting the hospital corridors? Or is there something more sinister hidden in the shadows? The truth, as always, may be scarier than any story we can imagine. I'm Anna, and I've been a nurse for over 10 years. My life had always been quite peaceful, but one night changed everything. It was a typical Friday at the Municipal Hospital of São Bento, a quiet little town in the interior of Brazil. The town has that rural charm, where everyone knows each other, and the nights are silent except for the distant sound of crickets. That night, I was on the night shift. The hospital was old, with long, dimly lit corridors, which always gave me an uneasy feeling. The silence was almost palpable, broken only by the occasional beep of a cardiac monitor or the sigh of a deeply sleeping patient. It was around 2 a.m. when it all began. The hospital was quiet. Most of the patients were asleep, and the few colleagues on duty were trying to make as little noise as possible. I was in the medication room, preparing some medicines, when I heard a soft sound of children's laughter. At first, I thought it was in my head, maybe just fatigue. After all, there had been many sleepless nights, and my body was beginning to feel the effects. But the laughter continued, and with each second, it seemed closer and more real. I left the room and went to the main corridor, where the sound seemed louder. The corridor was deserted, lit only by flickering fluorescent lights that gave the place an even more sinister look. My heart raced, but I continued, guided by the sound. That's when I saw her. A girl, about 6 or 7 years old, in a white dress stained with mud, sitting in the middle of the corridor. She was playing with an old, worn doll. The scene seemed like something out of a nightmare. I approached slowly, trying not to scare her. "Hi, sweetheart. Are you lost? Where are your parents?" I asked, trying to remain as calm as possible, although my hands were trembling. She looked up at me, and at that moment, a chill ran down my spine. Her eyes were deep, as if they had seen more than any child should. They held a sadness that made me swallow hard. She didn't answer, just continued playing with the doll, which seemed as old as the hospital itself. Each step I took towards her seemed to echo through the empty corridors, increasing my sense of discomfort. I crouched down, trying to get to her level. "Sweetheart, do you know where you are?" My voice came out more tremulous than I would have liked. She lifted the doll and whispered something I couldn't understand. I moved a bit closer, almost feeling the cold that emanated from her. Then before I could ask another question, a colleague, Joao, passed by me. "Anna, who are you talking to?" he asked, with a puzzled expression. I looked at him, then back to where the girl had been. She was no longer there. The corridor was empty, as if she had never been there. My heart raced, and a cold sweat ran down my forehead. "Didn't you see the girl?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but feeling fear growing inside me. "What girl, Anna? There's no one here." Joao looked at me worriedly. "Maybe you should rest a bit." I knew what I had seen. I knew that girl had been there. But how do you explain something like that? I decided not to say anything more and returned to the medication room, trying to focus on my work. But the laughter of that child continued to echo in my mind, and the feeling that something was terribly wrong didn't leave me. That night was the longest of my life. Every shadow seemed to hide something, every sound seemed a whisper coming from a distant place. When my shift finally ended, I left the hospital sure that something very strange was happening there. And little did I know that this was just the beginning. That scene haunted me. Who was that girl? Why had no one else seen her? I could barely sleep, and whenever I closed my eyes, I saw those sad eyes staring back at me. I decided I needed to uncover the truth. In the following days, I asked my colleagues about any child that had been recently admitted, but nobody knew anything. The next night, I was on duty again. The hospital felt more ominous than ever. Each step I took through the dimly lit corridors echoed off the old walls, and the feeling of being watched was constant. Around 3 a.m., I heard the laughter again. My heart raced, but I needed to find out what was happening. I followed the sound to an isolation room that was rarely used. The door was ajar, and there she was again, the girl with the doll. This time she was standing, looking out the window. I approached slowly, trying not to make a sound. Each step was a test of my bravery. "Hi, sweetheart. Are you okay?" I asked again, my voice almost a whisper. She turned slowly, and I realized her feet were not touching the ground. She was floating a few inches above the floor. My eyes widened, and a chill ran through my body. What I was seeing was impossible. "They won't let me leave," she whispered, her voice weak and distant, like an echo from another time. "Who won't let you leave?" I asked, trying to stay calm, but my voice trembled. She lifted her hand and pointed to a dark corner of the room. I looked in the direction she indicated, but saw nothing beyond the shadows. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, and everything fell silent. The only sounds were my panting breath and my heart pounding uncontrollably. I turned on the light, but the girl had vanished again. I felt a dark presence around me, and I could barely breathe. The air was heavy, loaded with a negative energy that seemed to want to crush me. I almost ran out of the room and went straight to the staff room. There I found Maria, an older nurse who had worked at the hospital for decades. I decided I needed to talk to her about what was happening. "Maria, I need to talk to you." "Something very strange is happening," I began, my voice still trembling. She looked at me with a mix of curiosity and concern. "What happened, Anna?" she asked, pulling up a chair for me to sit. I told her everything I had seen. The girl, the laughter, the door closing by itself. Maria listened in silence, and when I finished, she looked paler than I did. "Anna, there's something you need to know," she began, her voice serious. "Many years ago, a girl named Sophia disappeared from this hospital. She was admitted with a very high fever, and one night, she vanished without a trace. They never found her body." The revelation shocked me. Could the girl I saw be Sophia? What had happened to her? Why was she trapped in that hospital? Sophia's story wouldn't leave me in peace. Every time I thought of her, I felt an increasing need to find out what really happened. I decided I needed to go back to the hospital one last time, even if it was off my shift. I grabbed a flashlight and headed to the hospital at night, knowing it would be quieter then. The basement of the hospital was a place everyone avoided. The door was old and rusty, and the corridor leading to it was always poorly lit. I felt a shiver as I descended the stairs, each step echoing through the empty hallway. When I reached the basement door, I noticed it was ajar, as if someone had recently passed through. I entered slowly, trying not to make noise. The basement was a labyrinth of dusty boxes, old medical equipment, and shadows that seemed to move with the light of my flashlight. The air was dense and heavy, and I could feel a strange presence around me. At the back of the basement, I saw a small light shining. It was Sophia. She was sitting in a corner, holding her old doll. As I approached, I felt an intense cold and a deep sadness. Her face was paler than ever, and her sad eyes seemed to pierce my soul. "Sophia, I'm here to help you," I whispered, my voice broken by emotion. She slowly lifted her head and looked at me with a mix of hope and fear. "They won't let me leave," she repeated, her voice a distant and painful echo. "Who, Sophia? Who won't let you leave?" I asked, feeling desperation grow inside me. Before she could answer, I felt a presence behind me. I turned quickly and saw the shadows moving. They seemed to form human figures, but were just indistinct outlines, as if made of pure darkness. Fear took over me, but I needed to be strong for Sophia. "Leave her alone," I yelled, trying to drive the shadows away. The figures paused for a moment, then slowly receded, as if retreating. I turned my attention back to Sophia, who now seemed more relaxed but still frightened. "What happened to you, Sophia?" I asked gently, kneeling beside her. She began to speak, and her voice was like a whisper from a far-off place. "I was sick, very sick. One night, I woke up and saw those shadows. They took me here and never let me leave. They keep me trapped, making me relive that night over and over." My heart ached to hear her story. I needed to find a way to free her. I remembered an old legend my grandmother told about spirits trapped between worlds, who could only be released if someone acknowledged their pain and helped them find peace. "Sophia, we're going to get out of here. You're going to a better place, where there's no more pain," I said, holding her cold hand. Guiding her, I began to ascend the stairs. The shadows stirred again, but I continued, determined to take her out of that place. I felt resistance, as if the air itself was trying to hold us back. But I kept going, step by step, until we reached the main corridor. When we finally emerged from the basement, the hospital seemed different. The lights were brighter, and the air felt lighter. I took Sophia to the corridor window, where the moonlight illuminated her pale face. "You're free now, Sophia. You can go wherever you want," I whispered, feeling tears run down my face. She smiled for the first time, a sad but grateful smile. Slowly, her figure began to dissolve, melting into the moonlight. And then she was gone. I stood there, looking at the spot where she had been, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. Sophia was finally at peace, but what I had witnessed would change my life forever. I never returned to work the night shift, and every time I passed by the hospital, I felt a familiar presence, but now lighter, as if Sophia was finally free. Did you know that there are stories like this, of trapped souls, in many old hospitals? Who knows what else these walls hold? Wait until you hear the next story, and you'll see that not everything is as it seems. What do you think really happened to Sophia? Perhaps the answer is closer than we think.